All right, so we're going to begin talking more about community ecology, which is the study of how different species interact. And one of the major aspects of community ecology is studying competition between two species. So if there are two species who are competing after the same limiting resources, um, that cannot persist. So in this example, we have species 1, let's make this a bird, and this bird can eat small seeds and medium seeds, and species 2 can also eat medium seeds and large seeds. This green area represents competition, and in the long term, two species cannot coexist if they require the same limiting resource, in this case the seeds, the medium seeds. So the stronger competitor, species 1, over time will uh, occupy this niche and be able to eat the medium and small seeds, whereas species 2 will be regulated to just the larger seeds. That way, species 2 can still live, survive, reproduce, and grow, and so can species 1. The idea that two species who need the same resources cannot coexist is called the competitive exclusion principle. So two species cannot exist in the long term if they require the same resource. Most of the time in competition, species will separate and divide up the resource either in time or in space or based on their morphology. This is called resource partitioning. And in an example of temporal resource partitioning, if a wolf and a coyote exist in the same area, a lot of times they will predate on animals at different times to avoid competition. So maybe the wolf will target prey kind of in the daytime, where the coyote might try to target its prey in the nighttime, for one example. So they're going after the same types of prey items, but they go at them at different times, and so that way they avoid competition. Another example of resource partitioning is called spatial resource partitioning. In this example, the tar brush has roots that extract water and nutrients very deep down in the soil, whereas the black gamma grass only occupies the shallow space for its soil and minerals and nutrients. So it stays out of the reach of the tar brush and only occupies a really small space, so it doesn't have to directly compete with the tar brush for resources. Another prime example is of different types of small songbirds called warblers. In a single tree, different warblers will forage in different spaces to avoid competition. So the Cape May warbler might occupy the outer edge over here, where the bay-breasted warbler might occupy sort of the inside edge. There is some overlap, and then the myrtle warbler is on the low part of the tree. So populations can continue to coexist in the same, eating the same thing if they just occupy different space. Finally, there's morphological resource partitioning. This morphological resource partitioning is evolution of different body shapes that grants access to different forms of food. So these are both weasel-like organisms. There's the black-footed ferret and the ermine, and over time they evolve different morphology to be able to eat different resources so they don't have to compete with each other. Another kind of interaction, species interaction that community ecologists study is predation. There's several types of predation. There's the true predators, which kill other consumers. There's herbivores, which kill producers or eat producers. There's parasites that live on or in an organism they consume, like this tick here. And if the organism causes disease to the host, then they're called pathogens. And finally, my favorite is the parasitoid, or organisms that lay their eggs inside other organisms. In this example, we have parasitoid wasp eggs that are being laid inside the caterpillar. When the eggs hatch, they will consume their host for food and then go on to become adults. Another interaction study is called mutualism. Mutualism is where two species benefit by increasing both species' chances of reproduction. In this case, we're looking at a tree called an acacia tree, and the acacia tree has a mutualistic relationship with some ants. The ants provide protection for the tree. Uh, if something were to try to attack the tree, they would get attacked by the ants. And then if the ants will protect the tree from, the ants will protect the tree from herbivores and competing plants, and the thorns of the tree itself protect the ants so that they can have a space to lay their eggs and grow their young and survive. And the tree also provides food for the ants, nectar from the flowers. The last species interaction is called commensalism. Commensalism is where one species is benefited, but the other species really isn't harmed or benefited. The best case I could think of in Florida is Spanish moss. Now, Spanish moss grows on top of other trees to be able to capture sunlight easier, and for the most part, does not hurt or really help the tree that's growing on. In this case, a live oak. Now, of course, if there gets too much Spanish moss, then it reduces the amount of photosynthesis that the tree can do. Then it can turn into a parasitic relationship. But for the most part, Spanish moss on other trees is considered a commensalistic relationship. This is a good graphic that kind of shows you how these different interactions are classified. In competition, both species are negatively affected. In predation, one species is benefited, while another species is not as eaten. In mutualism, both species are benefited, and in commensalism, one species is benefited and the other species really isn't hurt or helped. Another idea in community ecology is the idea that some species sort of produce a bigger impact than other species in their environment. If they impact the environment for the better, we call them a keystone species, like this gopher tortoise here. They're called a keystone species because if this arch represents an ecosystem, the keystone species is the vital species for that ecosystem. If you take that keystone out, the entire system collapses. So we have gopher tortoises here in Central Florida. I see them around my neighborhood sometimes, and they dig very deep burrows. In these burrows, you can see tons of other critters can live inside the burrow. In this case, we have most of the pine forests in Central Florida the native pine forests are fire dependent, and when a fire goes through, these critters will use a gopher tortoise burrow as a refuge. When a fire isn't going on, a lot of these critters will live with the gopher tortoise burrow, and then some of these critters will continue to live in gopher tortoise burrows even if the gopher tortoise moves out. In fact, we have a snake called the eastern indigo snake that can only live in gopher tortoise burrows. So if we take that gopher tortoise out of the ecosystem, all the creatures that depend on this organism would not be able to survive. The composition of community changes over time, and when the plant community changes over time, we call that succession. We have two types of succession, primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession occurs on surfaces that are initially devoid of soil, such as rock, and then over time, they get colonized by plants. So over time, the rock will be colonized by lichens and mosses, and then by annual weeds, and then perennial weeds, eventually shrubs, and then eventually large trees. Secondary succession occurs in areas that have been disturbed but have not lost their soil. So think of fire, or think of land that was once pasture but then is allowed to grow on its own. As the plant community changes over time, we have different stages of forest succession. And different types of species depend on different stages of forest succession. So wise community managers will manage land for all the different stages of forest succession and not just one, to provide the most amount of biodiversity. Aquatic ecosystems also go through biodiversity as well. Here's one example of what some of our lakes are doing. Think of something like Lake Jessup. Lake Jessup is sort of in the later stages, where some of the earlier sinkhole lakes might be in some of the earlier stages. So eventually, over time, like all things, lakes have a lifespan as well. increased floating and submerged plants will eventually start to build up along the edges of the lake, and sediment will start to build up on the edge. And eventually, over time, it'll turn into sort of a wetland, and then after a while, it'll disappear. Last but not least, there's species richness is affected by many different factors. Is affected by latitude. As we move further away from the equator, we seem to see species diversity go down as we move towards the pole. Time, the longer an area has been around, the more species diversity it has. And then last but not least is the theory of island biogeography, which demonstrates the importance of habitat size and distance in determining species richness. So, for example, an island area, as the island area becomes larger, the number of bird species increases. Also, distance to the mainland. The further the distance of an island is away from the mainland, the less number of species we can find. And the reason why this is important is because we are fragmenting a lot of habitats that were once vast and connected into small habitat islands. So the ideas of island biogeography are becoming more and more important as we try to manage for species biodiversity within even in large continents without habitats. And those are some of the major ideas in Chapter 6. Didn't get to everything, but hopefully you got some of the key points, and we'll see you tomorrow in class. Thanks.